And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather is showing low pressure here off the Yukon Delta coast, keeping snow in from, say, Togiak Bay northward there across the Seward Peninsula with lighter, more scattered amounts here into the Kuskokwim Valley. And then the system washes out here along the North Gulf Coast and leaving some snow showers behind here. Again, this shifting northward and then slowing down as it makes landfall. So snow showers, Prince William Sound, back into the Manauskas-Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet, North Gulf Coast, and into the northern Panhandle. Next system down to the south here, increasing the wind and rain, mainly Dixon Entrance and the Queen Charlottes tonight. But tomorrow that spreads northward with a good increase in the winds here all across the Panhandle, with the heaviest precipitation down to the south and not much up to the north. Central eastern interior, dry and cold with light winds, variably cloudy skies, lingering snow showers here, turning an arm into Prince William Sound. And also still snow showers here along the southwest coast with a much weaker now southerly flow. The main low center back to the west here. Next front brings gale force winds into the western Aleutians. And on Thursday, that front brings the gale force winds in the eastern Aleutians with snow and increasing wind for the Alaska Peninsula, snow and blowing snow for the Pribilofs. Dry, light winds, interior Alaska with a fair amount of clearing in some areas, especially central and eastern part of the state. And it stays wet and unsettled over the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle. Northeast winds for Wednesday at 30 knots. North to northeast 25-knot winds for the central coast. And northeast 15 to 25 for the north coast. And Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots. Northeast 20 gusts 35 knots for Stevens Passage. And Clarence Strait, southeast winds 25 knots. For Thursday, east winds 30 knots, gusting 45 knots here on the south coast. East-northeast at 25 knots for the central coast. And up to the north coast, lighter winds, north to northeast at 10 to 15 knots. And for Lynn Canal, north winds 20, gusting 35 knots. Only 10 knots out of the north for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait. Southeast winds 25 knots with 10-foot seas. And for Prince William Sound tomorrow, west winds 10 knots on the North Gulf Coast, west or west-south winds, west-southwest winds at 15 knots. And Cook Inlet, northeasterlies 15 to 25 knots. And for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, east-southeast winds at 25. And for Thursday, Kamishak Bay, northwesterlies at 20 knots here, northwest 25 for the Barren Islands. Cook Inlet, variable to north winds at 10 knots, 10 to 15 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, north winds 15 to 20 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds 15 knots. Kodiak Island, southeast winds 25 knots, otherwise light and variable for Shelikof Strait. And for the Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds at 15 knots, south winds 15 knots for Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay on Thursday, east winds at 10 knots. Small craft advisories here for the western Alaska Peninsula. Southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, variable to northwest winds 10 to 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians for Wednesday, west winds 15 to 20 knots. West winds 20 knots for Adak and Atka. And then the next system picking the winds up, gale force winds here coming into the Aleutians, south to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. And then for Thursday, south winds 25 knots from Chitka Island, but from Kiska to Shemya, north to northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. South to southeast 25-knot winds for Adak and Atka. And then good gales for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 40 to 45 knots. Southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island for Wednesday, south winds of 15 knots. Brisk wind advisory, though, for Norton Sound. East winds 25 knots there. St. Matthew Island, north winds at 15 knots and westerlies at 20 knots for St. Paul and St. George. And for the Pribilofs on Thursday, gale warning, southeast winds 35 knots with 11-foot seas. East winds 35 knots for St. Matthew Island. Kuskokwim Delta Coast, southeast at 15. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, east winds at 20 knots. Up to the north, brisk wind advisories tomorrow for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. West winds 25 to 30 knots. Southwest at 15 for the central coast, and then east winds 25 knots for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea. East to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for Thursday here, the Chukchi Sea, basically south winds 10 to 20 knots, varying directions there a little bit. South 20 for the western Arctic coast. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southwest winds 10 to 15 knots.